as I mentioned before the break, we are going to be joined by the wonderful Associate Professor, Dr. Lynn Riley. I'll let you introduce yourself, Tony.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name's Lynette Riley. I'm a Radgeri Nation person, Marang Nungari, Mang Willinga Radgeri. I'd like to pay homage and respect to my families of the Radgeri and Kangaroo Nation. So that's Dubbo and Moree mobs. So we're kind of spread across the country. And today I'm specifically focusing on the use of Aboriginal cultural traditions in art, but specifically in response to my cultural practice in Wiradjuri with kangaroo skin cloak making. I'm just going to talk and take you through what is in my presentation and talk to you about what the importance is of my cultural practice in relation to art, teaching, and in Aboriginal education in general. I put this presentation together in response to last year, I was doing a presentation to some students who had already done their training in their own specific disciplines, and now they were doing the additional units and training to become high school teachers. And so my presentation was on kinship and cultural practice and the importance of it and what was happening for me personally in my family. And I always allow some question and answer time. And at the end of the presentation, one of the students put their hands up with their question. And the question to me was, but I don't understand. What has this got to do with my teaching? And I had some students who'd done a lot of work with me sitting in the audience, and they just turned around with a look of horror, and they were awestruck and going, what do you mean? What's this got to do with your teaching? And I think that that deserves an answer. So that's why the presentation came to me as something that was important. So I think one of the primary issues is that we still do not have a clear understanding in this country. You know, when you said to people, type in what your country connections are, I don't think that the use of Aboriginal nation names is still in general use across this country. People are not sure what an Aboriginal nation is, what a clan is, and a lot of that's got to do with misunderstandings of the influence that has been created by anthropology in not processing and acknowledging the various Aboriginal nations across this country, and the use of terms like tribe. And what they did was, I've actually read discussions between anthropologists and Aboriginal elders who actually said, oh, well, is it actually a clan or is it a tribe? And Aboriginal elders were saying, no, we have nations and clans. And anthropologists decided, no, they're actually tribes. So what they've done is they collapsed nations and clan groups together and said, well, Aboriginal people have tribes. So I think that my presentation is up and running. That front cover is a photo of my sister and I at the Macquarie River back home wearing our cloaks and headdresses. So the next slide just is a quick introduction into where the Radgeri Nation is. So you'll see Wiradjuri and Kangaroo Nations are two of the biggest nations across New South Wales and into Queensland. And we do not sit nicely into the state boundaries and borders. And that's created huge problems for us over the years by different government agencies and policies and practices. In my acknowledgement, I just want to say that when I talk about Aboriginal education, it's personal. There's no way I can get away from it and have it as something that's neutral and apart from me. It's personal. This is about the job that I've been given by the elders in my community to be a conduit in terms of learning and getting Aboriginal education introduced into the curriculum. So a greater understanding of Aboriginal people, our cultures, better education for our kids. So I have specific academic and educational roles and responsibilities, but I also have a responsibility in my own self for my own cultural learnings and what that means for me in terms of my roles and responsibilities in my community. And that's often had to take a back seat because of the huge call on me in academia and education. So I think getting a bit older now, I'm trying to have a better balance so that I have that. I also have a responsibility to my family and community, and the photo on the right is of some of my nieces and my grandchildren, and they all come in all different colours. I've got redheads there and blondies, but they're all my grandchildren. And so I have a responsibility to them to make sure that they're proud of who they are as Aboriginal people and that their identity is strong. And so I work on that with my sisters because we take joint responsibility of all our kids in those cultural learnings. The next slide, please. I'm speaking specifically about the Radgeri Nation, but in doing so, I think it's everybody's responsibility to understand the history of contact and the culture of the people upon whose land you live and where you work. The Radgeri people are the people of the three rivers, so between the Wumble, the Macquarie, the Clare, the Lachlan and the Murrumbidgee rivers. We've lived in these lands for over 40,000 years, and I'm saying that as a very loose estimation because as science is improving their scientific methods, our ownership and links to country goes back further and further and further.
On that note, there was an article in 2019 that was released, and it was a site down in Victoria that actually had an Aboriginal site that they found that was dated at 80,000 years old.
Absolutely.
So yes, absolutely.
Yep.
And it is according to Western science. Unfortunately, we do have to work within the systems. But that was a discovery in 2019, 80,000 years.
And so the understandings and beliefs that Aboriginal people have that we've always been here, unfortunately, is always having to be proven by Western science until it's, accepted. So we need to understand our languages across our different countries, that we do have dialects within our language groups, and understanding the kinship of the country upon whose land we stand. The nation totem for our country is the Guuga, the Goanna, and so that helps us understand the connections and responsibilities of each nation and clan group across country. The clan totem for my country, for the Dabaga people, is the Willay, the brush-tailed possum. Thank you. The next slide is just some images of the history of contact, and the history of contact with Wiradjuri people is really fraught. It's really a hard history because the colonial government at the time decided to use the Radgeri Nation as an example of and to put fear into other Aboriginal groups as to what would happen to them if they didn't toe the line. So having said that, first contact with Europeans when they crossed the Blue Mountains, which is an Aboriginal track, so they didn't invent or find anything, they followed our tracks. You can find that there's a lot known about European settlement across the mountains, but very little written about Aboriginal people's history and where they lived. The initial contact was actually reported to be peaceful, but in the Bathurst area, what happened was there was a huge yam field, and Aboriginal people had been farming and redigging and harvesting this yam field. And so what they did was they actually shared the yams with the new settlers because they had no food. And that you don't let anybody starve. So you share the food, and they were sharing the food. And then the settlers went, oh, well, if yams grow here, then potatoes must be able to grow here. So they actually dug up and replaced the yams with their own potatoes. And so when people turned up, our people, they went, well, this is our field. We shared our yams with you. We must be able to share the potatoes. And then they were told that they were thieving, that they were stealing their property, and war broke out. And a lot of those people were massacred because the sharing didn't go both ways. There is some work written on that by Dennis Foley, and it's really an interesting read.
Is that link at the bottom?
Yes, there's a link down the bottom that you can see that is really important. So first contact was really complex, and the nature of the frontier relationships was fraught with the expansion of pastoralism, the fighting over land. The Europeans that were coming into the area were all men, so then they were fighting for Aboriginal women, and there was a lot of massacres and killing because they wanted Aboriginal people off the land so that they could take it over and farm it. What we did find, though, was in that history was that there were some sympathetic property owners, and a lot of Aboriginal people might go and reside with them for protection. But in turn for that protection, they had to work the land. Some people might call that slave labour. Let's not, hide what it really was, because Aboriginal workers were used to build those very expansive and now highly productive pastoralist properties. There was a lot of intermarriage and kinship expanded. So Aboriginal people were marrying in with the Irish and the Chinese. And you'll find that across Radgeri, quite a few of us have Irish names and we have Chinese links. And I think that's because the Irish and the Chinese also had to face a lot of the racism that we did. And so there was a kind of a sympathetic relationship with one another. And I found that really interesting. I went to Ireland a few years ago with one of my daughters, and when the Irish heard my name, they said, but you're Irish. And I'd say, no, I'm Aboriginal. And they'd go, well, how come you've got an Irish name? And I said, well, that's because the Irish liked us a lot more than the British. And they just laughed and they went, oh, darling, we understand. We understand completely. So we need to understand what are the symbiotic relationships with other groups. A lot of the conflict came about because homesteads started to be built on Aboriginal home sites, because the sites that we lived on, where there was a lot of water, where there was a lot of fresh food, where there was, etc., it was at a safe distance from floods, etc. Well, the colonists coming in saw those as really pretty good areas to live, so they took over our sites and they lived where we were living. So there was a really interesting relationship. It was fraught, it was harrowing, and we need to know that history and to understand why we're at where we're at now. Next slide. So part of that for me is about understanding the social and family histories of this country, because we do not understand the impact on families and what the social outcomes were if you don't understand what the policies and practices were of the time. So I've got some family images here. The top left-hand one is actually a Bunjalung one. The little boy being nursed by the man in the hat on the far left, that's actually my father-in-law, Roy Mundine. And he actually gave me this photo and has let me use it. At the time that he was a baby, he was 18 months in this photo. The 1850s was when pastoral expansion began. His father was born in 1876, Harry Mundine, and Roy was born in 1990. So this is when the policy of extermination was arising and Aboriginal people were being forced onto reserves, missions and stations. You need to understand the significance and difference of those three. That's another lecture. By 1883, you have the Aborigines Protection Act. So it was decided that so many Aboriginal people were dying, they needed to do something. So let's create an Aboriginal Protection Act and move Aboriginal people onto reserves and missions to protect them. I always go, well, I wonder who they were actually protecting. They actually saw this as smoothing the dying pillow, that Aboriginal people were a dying race and they were just going to move us onto reserves and missions and allow us to die out of sight, out of mind. And by 1897, they had the Aborigines Protection Act and the restriction of the sale of opium. So you can see where they placed us. Now, the photo on the right is actually a photo that I got from one of my uncles, Tom Riley, and that's the little boy standing in front of the older gentleman with the beard. That's my great-grandfather, George Carr. Now, the reason I wanted to show you that is that Uncle Tom was identified in our community as a really clever little boy. He spoke 2 Aboriginal languages plus English. And so the community identified him as somebody they needed to go to school and to learn. So they got him into a school, and then Uncle Tom was trying to explain to us what had happened to him. He was so excited and really liked his teacher a lot, and he wanted to show off to his teacher. So one day he was speaking Radgeri. He was saying to us, this is the only thing I can understand about it. So he was speaking Radgeri, and the teacher decided he was speaking rude and dirty language. And she got the police to come to the school and take him away. We're not quite sure of his age, whether he was about 6 or 8. And so that afternoon, when all the kids come home from school, Uncle Tom's not with them. And my grandmother said, where's Tom? Where is he? And the kids said, well, we don't know. The teacher sent him away. She goes up to see the teacher. The teacher said he was being rude and dirty. The police have come and got him. She goes to the police station, and at that time, Aboriginal people had no legal rights. He was sent away to a juvenile detention centre as a 6 or 8-year-old for a couple of years for speaking his language. So the impact there was that our grannies and aunts and uncles and grandparents said, we can't lose our kids. We can't afford to lose our kids. And so what you will have happening in most communities is either it all went underground and you were told not to speak or show that you had any Aboriginal culture, pretend you're assimilated, don't talk like that in front of white people, or they just said wipe it. Because, kids are like, they can't control themselves. They'll start talking about what they know. And so this is the history that is being addressed here in this country in terms of teaching. Next slide, please. So we have people like my Uncle Ted, who spoke 8 languages, Aboriginal languages, plus English. So it's not celebrated that we're clever and talented and gifted people. We're told we're unable to have an education because we're incapable of learning, because we may not speak English very well. The photo on the right is a photo of my grandparents, and my dad is a taller boy, and my Uncle Stan and Auntie June. Uncle Tom's missing because that was when he was taken away by the police. I remember as a kid looking at this photo and thinking, gee, my gran looks really sad. I wonder why. And then going back and getting the history and understanding why. I might say that at that time that photo was taken, scientists had just done research to prove that Aboriginal people's brain capacity was really small, and therefore they're incapable of learning, and therefore they don't need any formal education. I always challenge my students to look at that photo and you tell me that these people look like they're incapable of learning and that they're not talented and gifted and smart people. I dare you. I dare you. And yet policies are about covering all people, never about individuals, and everybody has to fall into that policy and practice. And that's what's scary. Next slide. I'm just going to go through these rather quickly. It's my Uncle Alec, who was a tracker in the police force, and the racism that he was facing when he was in the police force, such as having to pay into a pension fund and then not being able to access it because he was Aboriginal, not being allowed to go onto properties and find kids that were missing because he was Aboriginal, and knowing that children died because certain family members wouldn't let as he was told, abos onto his property. Absolutely talented and gifted man, but not allowed to have a proper role. Thank you. The next slide is, this is where I start to come into it. That's me on the far right with my sister with the little curly hair. I was cute. I won't say how I am now, but I was cute. So, you know, what is the histories that individuals have had to face? I wanted to point out the bottom left-hand photo. That's my gran from Moree, Granny Maud, and all of the children there are first cousins. And I wanted to point out the little boy in overalls right in the middle at the front. That's my cousin Michael. Now, Michael, like my other brothers and sisters, I was the only one that went through in the AB classes, but my other sisters and brothers were all placed in the OA classes. My sister Diane, who's now a teacher, says that she knows that the reason she went into the OA classes, we used to call them only Aboriginal, but it was also meant that OA meant in those days, not now, but in those days that you were borderline retarded and incapable of learning. They all were in OA classes. Michael was in an OA class. Michael now has his artwork on permanent display in Paris. Not bad for an OA. My sister Diane has a teacher qualifications and a master's. Not bad for somebody who was only allowed to go through school in OA classes. So it's really important to understand the social impact of policies on practices on Aboriginal people in anywhere you go. Next slide, please. Here's a copy of the Certificate of Exemption. That's my father on the left and my father-in-law on the right. Most people are not aware of a Certificate of Exemption. A Certificate of Exemption meant you're exempt from being Aboriginal. If you wanted to have a job, you wanted to go to your kids to go to school. That's why my dad got one. He wanted us to go to school. He also was really concerned that his uncles who returned from the war were not entitled to land grants like other soldiers. They were made to go back straight onto the reserve. So he said he resented that and he wanted his kids to have an opportunity. I hate these, but I understand that without one of these, I would not have the same access to education. My cousins, whose parents refused to get a Certificate of Exemption, they went to school on the other side of town, and that meant that they were all put into OA classes. I went to school on this side of town because my parents had a Certificate of Exemption and I was able to go into an A, B or whatever class. It also tells you how much of an Aboriginal you are. Are you half or are you a quarter? So it's a very divisive document. This was in operation until the 1967 when the referendum came. It slowly started to fade by 69, and 69 is when I started high school. So I happen to have been born and in a really appropriate time. I've got cousins who are only 3 years older than me that didn't get access to the same level of education that I did. Next slide, please. Okay, so got into high school in 67, got into AB study was introduced when I started high school. It was also introduced when I started to finish high school, so I was able to get into teachers college and being the first person in the extended family to finish high school. Next slide, please. So for most Aboriginal people, we're all doing histories of firsts, all of us. This is just me. Have a look at everybody. We're all doing histories of firsts. I just got promoted to Associate Professor in January this year, and being in university, I just took it as, oh, well, it's just, you know, part of the job. But over Christmas, our extended family got together and my sister called all the family together. There's like about 40 of us together. That's Christmas Day, and gave this speech about how important I was and how proud everybody in the family and community was. I'm going to start crying, that I was now an associate professor. And that you're not just getting these jobs and roles for yourself, you're getting it for your family. And she also spoke about it in relation to being a validation for our mum and dad, who were only allowed to go to 3rd grade because they were Aboriginal. And so all of the things that they did to support me, to help me get through education, was this is a validation that they could have done it if they'd been allowed, because government policy wouldn't allow them at the time. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the cultural practice, it's important to understand that our cultural practice was criminalised. It became a crime and a way to force assimilisation and to civilise, in inverted commas, Aboriginal people. We used the Kangaroo Cloaks as clothing and as shelter and as warmth. They were taken off of us and we were supplied with the grey government blankets, you know, with the old crimson stripe through them. They were horrible. I still remember them. They were as itchy as hell and they weren't very warm. Next slide, please. So currently there are very few cloaks on display in the world. Some are in Australia and some are internationally. That's because traditionally the cloaks were made personally for people, and often those cloaks got buried with people. And so that's why you don't see a lot of them. Next slide, please. So the significance and purpose of the cloaks is an everyday purpose for warmth, protection, shelter, to carry our babies. They were highly traded. They were marriage gifts, depending upon your talent in making them. Sometimes people might really fight over them. But the other thing was that it's a group effort. You do things together. And as you're doing them together, you sit and talk about family business or clan business or nation business, and you sort out all the problems in that way. Often a cloak would be started as soon as a child was conceived and thought of or born, to tell their life journey. And so that cloak would not ever be used by any other person. That was their life story on the cloak. And it told who that person was. So they always carried their life story with them. And if anybody was interested, they would sit down and start to talk about what their life journey was and what their purpose in life was. Next slide, please. Why do I make the cloaks? It's about relearning the symbols. I'm just relearning Radgeri symbols at the moment, and hopefully I'll go into learning Gamilaroi ones. It's about re-establishing a cultural tradition, recording my family's histories and bloodlines on the cloaks for my kids and others. And I really enjoy it as a form of artwork because it's my own cultural revitalisation, and it's challenging and relaxing. I can't tell you how much research I actually do in creating a cloak. Next slide, please. So here's an example of some of the cloaks that I make. The first cloak I ever made was the one on the left, the goanna and energy tree. I might tell you, I went home to Dubbo and my sister was making a cloak for a ceremony, and I said to her, because I hadn't seen it before, I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "Oh, this is kangaroo cloak making." And I said, "I want to have a go at that." And she looked at me and she seriously said, "Lynn, I don't think you can do this. You need to have really fine motor skills." Ooh. I won't tell you what I actually said to her, but she had to give me a skin right then and there so I could do a cloak. So that was the first attempt, and I discovered that I have a really keen eye, and I just love the patterns in the animals, on their skins and in the trees. And so this has made me become more aware of the world around me, of nature, and makes me study it more and build it into my cloak making. So those are some of the cloaks I've made there for my sister on the top, my daughter on the top right, my son on the bottom right, and Larry Brandy, who's a Wiradjuri storyteller. So one of the things I do in my family is, as my kids get their own personal totems, I make a cloak for them as part of that identification that they get to carry with them. Next slide. So if you see a cloak, for instance, you may not think much about it, but here's an example of one of the cloaks that I've made and what are all the different symbols on that cloak. And each cloak is totally different and in its own context. Zoe could make a cloak using the same symbols, but it would have a totally different context and a different meaning because she's now telling her story, but it would be represented in a different way. But we're still using the same symbols and cloaks. It's just like if you're writing a story in English, you're using the same words, but the narrative is yours. So part of what I'm doing is also to teach about the symbols, because a lot of that was lost, reaffirming them and getting them back out in general use and understanding. Next slide.
I've got a question on that. Sorry. For those tuning in as well, I know there are many teachers that have Google searched Aboriginal art symbols with right intentions of ways of bringing Aboriginal storytelling and art into a classroom. Now, you mentioned that this is Radgeri symbols, and as you said, if I did it, it would be completely different because I'm Bunjalung. So while we might have the same symbols, different meanings. What would you say, or what would be some advice for anyone tuning in or who might be interested? How would you navigate bringing art into teachings right way, though?
This is about community engagement, and this is about getting to know your community. This is where you localise the curriculum, you go and talk to people in the local community and find out who has the knowledge and who's willing to share. You cannot ever just walk up to someone and say, "You're Aboriginal, I want you to teach me this." Unfortunately, that's what often happens. So it's really important that you find out who are the people in the community who understand the symbols and practices, but more importantly, are comfortable in teaching and sharing, and that the local community are happy for that to be passed on and taught. Nobody in the community will teach unless they're able to. My sister and I hold a lot of exhibitions now, and the first exhibition we held was in Dubbo, and so we had forums for our elders in our community. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to be there. My sister Diane was, and she said that when they saw the cloaks, a lot of them cried because they hadn't seen them before. So it's really, but then what they said was, it's your job now to make sure you go and help people understand that this is our cultural practice and it needs to be passed on.
Absolutely.
I think that I talk too much. I always do. There is so much more that I could talk about, but I will just provide my presentation for people to have a look at. What I'd really like to do right now is just show you in the last few minutes of my presentation. One of the things I do is that, it's not because I'm an academic, obviously, but if I make a cloak for someone, the rule is you have to let me take photos of you wearing your cloak, and you have to let me interview you about the importance of the cloak. So this is an interview I did with my sister. It's not professional by any stretch of it's a yarn with my sister in the backyard about the cloak I made for her. So we'll just finish with that, I think.
That sounds perfect.
I'm having an interview with Diane Riley McNaboe, and we're going to have a discussion about the cloak that's been made for her. Before we start, Diane, can you just tell people what year you were born?
I was born in 1960, the 31st of the 1st 60. I'm 52 years of age at the moment, and this is my first cloak that's been made for me by my big sister Lynette.
Yeah, you have to have something made for you by your big sister, don't you? Diane, can you just tell us what the nations are that you're affiliated to?
On my father's side, I'm related to the Radgeri people, the Rileys, Dubbo Wellington Rileys, and we go all the way up to the other side of Lithgow. That was our traditional tracks. And my mother's side, it's Gamilaroi country, or as my grandmother used to say, Gumaroi mob. So that's Tumala, Bogabilla, Old Yarraba Mission, New Yarraba, and Moree mob.
Okay, so we cover pretty much the whole state, don't we?
Yes.
Just about.
Yeah, just about.
Can I get you to talk about the cloak that's been made for you and what it symbolises?
Yeah. Some of my favourite trees are out at the traditional site of ours called Terramungamine. And I take my sister out there to look at the trees and that and show her my favourite trees. So she's actually put the patterns from one of my favourite trees on my cloak. I just love the patterns and that she's put in them. On the tail, she's got the pattern for the land, our traditional pattern for the land, and she's also got the spirit fellas that walk on the land and the energy that comes from them. So the dots in the middle are the energy that comes from them and also links those fellas together. Down here, I've got my grandmother's side from Moree and Toomla Bagabillamob. She's got the emu tracks in the middle. My grandmother's the one that's made darker over this side. And this is my grandfather. So my grandmother, Nanny Wright, my grandfather, Ben Wright, and my mother was actually the eldest of all the girls. So we've got the girls and the boys on this side. So my mother and my aunties and my uncles down here. And you've also got the land that they that's connected to that mob. And down here I've got my father's side. So this is my grandmother, Granny Riley, possum mob, and my father, my grandfather, Eric Riley. And then over here you got my father, who is the middle child, and he had one sister. Over this side I've got my mum and my dad, so they're in really dark colours, and kangaroo, because we're also great kangaroo country. And I'm the youngest out of the girls, so there's 3 girls and 3 boys from my mum and dad, and I'm the youngest girl. So I'm the baby girl, and I always say my sister has to look after me. Or I still tell mum. We no longer have mum with us, but we always think of her and always say, I'm going to tell mum on you if you don't look after me. Over this side is myself in the dark and my husband, still on possum country, the kangaroo tracks, the emu tracks. So they're the different groups that I'm associated with. Down here I've got 3 girls and 1 boy. And the birds also in the tree represent my 4 children as well. Down here we've got the magpie. So the magpie is my personal totem. And I think my sister's done a real good job on my magpie. I'm really happy with my magpie. And I always have magpies hanging around me. I'll never have one attack me, which is really good. And then we've got our goanna tracks. The goanna, the gugar is our totem for the whole of the Radgeri Nation. So we had to have our goanna tracks in there. The magpie's name, our traditional name for the magpie is Garu. So that's the magpie Garu. And I think he's Murrumbung, really good Garu. In here she's got all different lines and everything in here to mark all the different layers that are about myself and all the different people that I'm associated with, the different connections, and that different spirits that watch over us, take care of us, look after us. The different knots and that in the tree that I just love the knots in the tree. I just love to feel the patterns and stuff. We've got different little campsites, possum tracks, our stars, and different symbols down here that mean different things to us as Radgeri people. So the possum track is the Radgeri symbol. This star pattern is, the sun pattern is specifically Radgeri. Some people will say Wiradjuri. I'm saying Wiradjuri because I'm using the voice sounds. So that's just the way that I heard my father and mother saying it when I was young. So there's different symbols in that mean stuff to us down on the bottom. So I'm very proud of my emu cloak and the job that my sister did for me.
So what does it mean for you to have a cloak like this made for you?
It's very important because we weren't allowed to practice our culture. We weren't allowed to make our cloaks and we weren't allowed to see our old people making them. So to have one like this was like Christmas.
She's going to cry.
Sorry. It's just really special that someone would take the effort and the time to make the cloaks so that we could try one and wear them for our old fellas. Sorry. Yeah, because our old fellas were never allowed to make their cloaks on their missions and reserves. So this is so important to all of us. Thank you, my sister. I love you. Yeah. Sookie.
That's what happens with
I'm the baby girl, so I'm allowed to be a sook. I've got my sister who look after me. Yeah.
So what would you say to other people about having something like this that we can show people and as a record of who we are and what we do?
Well, this is another form of language for us. We always look at the verbal language or the songs, and we look at artwork and stuff like that, but we never look at our burning, our traditional burning and carving on that down this way in New South Wales. So this is our traditional way of representing our artwork in our country, and there's not enough of it shown, and our children need to still see this.
Okay, so
Yeah.
thank you for that.
Yeah.
I appreciate it, and I appreciate the sentiments that you're giving about
Yeah,
this.
and make them.
That's what big sisters do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.